The weight of command. General Marcus Thompson had seen more than his share of battlefields, but nothing quite prepared him for the chaos that unfolded in the autumn of 1945. The war in Europe had officially ended months ago, yet pockets of resistance and desperate acts of violence still plagued the occupied territories. At 52 years old, Marcus was one of the few black generals in the United States Army, a position he'd earned through decades of exemplary service, countless battles, and an unwavering commitment to justice that transcended the color lines that had tried to contain him. The morning air in the small German town of Rothenburg carried the acrid smell of smoke from recent skirmishes. Marcus stood on the balcony of the commandeered town hall, his sniper rifle, a Springfield M1903A, for that had been his companion through North Africa, Sicily, and France, resting against the stone railing. It wasn't standard issue for a general, but Marcus had always believed in being prepared for anything. The weapon had saved his life more times than he could count, long before the stars adorned his shoulders. His adjutant, Lieutenant James Corwin, approached with the morning reports. "Sir, the reconnaissance teams have swept sectors 4 through 7. No signs of organized resistance, but civilians are reporting suspicious activity near the old textile mill on the eastern edge of town." Marcus nodded, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. The textile mill had been a focal point of Nazi manufacturing during the war, and intelligence suggested it might still harbor remnants of SS officers unwilling to accept defeat. What kind of activity? Armed men, possibly 3 or 4, holed up in the upper floors. They've been taking potshots at anyone who comes near. The British liaison wants to storm the building, but given the civilian population nearby, I recommended we wait for your assessment. It was this careful consideration that had earned Marcus the respect of soldiers under his command, regardless of their backgrounds. In a segregated army where black officers were rare and often relegated to support roles, Marcus had broken through barriers not just through combat prowess, but through an uncommon wisdom that valued every life equally. "Gather a small reconnaissance team," Marcus ordered. "I want eyes on that mill before we make any moves. And Lieutenant, tell the civilians to stay indoors until we've resolved this situation. The last thing we need is innocent people caught in crossfire." As Corwin departed to execute the orders, Marcus lifted his binoculars and studied the mill in the distance. The 3-story brick structure stood like a sentinel against the gray sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. Something about the situation felt wrong. The war was over. Why would trained soldiers risk their lives in such an obvious position? It didn't match the tactical thinking of the SS officers he'd faced before. The radio on his belt crackled to life. "General Thompson, this is Reconnaissance Team Alpha. We have visual on the mill, confirming 4 armed individuals on the 3rd floor. They appear agitated, possibly panicked. Sir, we're picking up something else, crying. It sounds like a child." Marcus felt his blood run cold. A child. In all his years of warfare, the one constant that had driven him forward was the protection of innocents, especially children who had no part in the wars waged by their elders. His own childhood in segregated Mississippi had taught him the cruelty that humans could inflict upon the powerless, and he'd sworn long ago that he would use whatever power he gained to prevent such suffering wherever he found it. "Can you confirm the child's location?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the urgency coursing through him. "Negative, sir, but the crying is coming from inside the building. The armed men seem to be using the child as leverage, possibly to prevent an assault." Marcus made his decision in an instant. He grabbed his rifle and headed for the stairs. "Corwin, give me a vehicle and 2 volunteers. We're going to the mill." Ghosts of war. The Jeep bounced along the rutted road leading to the textile mill, with Marcus at the wheel and 2 experienced soldiers flanking him. Sergeant Robert Hayes, a sharpshooter from Ohio, and Corporal David Martinez, a combat medic whose hands had saved countless lives on the beaches of Normandy. Both men had volunteered without hesitation when they heard a child was in danger. As they approached within 500 yards of the mill, Marcus pulled the Jeep behind a partially destroyed barn. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the weathered wood, carrying with it the distant sound of raised voices speaking rapid German. Through his binoculars, Marcus could now see the situation more clearly. For men, dressed in a mixture of civilian clothes and military remnants, occupied the third floor. Their body language spoke of desperation rather than military discipline. These aren't professional soldiers, Marcus observed, passing the binoculars to Hayes. Look at how they're holding their weapons, how they keep checking the stairs. They're terrified. Hayes studied the scene carefully. You're right, sir. They look like they're trapped rather than defending a position. But why would they have a child with them? It was a question that gnawed at Marcus. In his experience, true soldiers, even enemy soldiers, generally followed certain codes of conduct. Using a child as a human shield was the act of either the most fanatical or the most desperate. From what he could see, these men appear to be the latter. Martinez, what can you tell me about the child from here? Marcus asked. The medic adjusted his own binoculars, focusing on a small window on the second floor where a tiny face had briefly appeared. Brief glimpse, sir, but looked like a young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Appeared frightened but mobile. I didn't see any obvious injuries. Marcus lowered his binoculars and considered their options. A direct assault risked the child's life. Waiting could mean the situation deteriorated further. What they needed was information and a way to communicate with the men inside. Sir, Corporal Martinez spoke up. I recognize the dialect they're speaking. It's not standard German. It's from this region specifically. These might be local men, not military at all. This changed everything. Can you communicate with them? Ja, main general, Martinez replied, slipping into German briefly before returning to English. My grandmother was from a town 20 miles from here. I grew up speaking the dialect. Marcus felt the pieces beginning to align. Then we need to find out what they want and why they have that child. But first, we need to get closer without being seen. Hayes, you and I will move to that cluster of trees 50 yards northeast. Martinez, stay here with the radio. If anything goes wrong, call for backup. But remember, that child's life is the priority. The two men moved with the practiced stealth of combat veterans, using the terrain and debris for cover. When they reached the tree line, Marcus set up his sniper rifle on a natural rest formed by a fallen log. Through the scope, he could now see the men's faces clearly. They were young, barely out of their teens, with eyes that spoke of weeks without proper sleep. These weren't hardened SS officers. They were boys playing at war, and they were in over their heads. One of them, a lanky youth with blonde hair, kept pacing near a small door, occasionally shouting something down into the building. Marcus adjusted his scope and caught a glimpse through another window. There on the second floor, huddled in a corner, was the child. A little girl with dark braids, wearing a torn blue dress, her face streaked with tears. I have a clear shot on 3 of them, Hayes whispered, settling his rifle into position. But the 4th keeps moving behind that support beam, and we still don't know exactly where the child is in relation to them. Marcus knew that shooting their way out of this situation was a last resort. One stray bullet, one unexpected reaction, and that little girl could die. We need to talk to them first. Let's get Martinez up here with the megaphone from the Jeep. Minutes later, with Martinez positioned safely behind cover, the corporal's voice rang out in German across the open space. You in the mill. We know you have a child in there. We want to help you. Nobody needs to die today. There was a long silence. Then one of the young men appeared at a window, shouting back. Stay away. We have weapons. We'll use them. Martinez translated quickly. He says they're former Hitler youth, sir. The war ended, and their parents were arrested as Nazi collaborators. The little girl is the daughter of an SS officer who was executed. They took her because they didn't want her to end up in an orphanage or worse. They're trying to get her to her grandmother in Bavaria. Marcus absorbed this information, his mind racing. These weren't monsters. They were misguided young people who thought they were protecting a child, not understanding that their methods were putting her in greater danger. Tell them we can help, Marcus called out. Tell them the child doesn't have to go to an orphanage. We can arrange for her to reach her family safely, but they need to let her go first. The negotiation continued for another 30 minutes, with Marcus demonstrating a patience that surprised even his own men. He spoke of his own childhood, of being powerless and afraid, of understanding what it meant to fight against a system that seemed insurmountable. Slowly, gradually, the tone of the exchange began to shift. But just as progress seemed possible, a shot rang out from a different direction. British forces, unaware of the delicate negotiation, had begun their own approach to the mill. The moment of truth. The single rifle shot shattered the fragile trust that Marcus had been carefully building. Inside the mill, the young men scattered from the windows, shouting in panic. Marcus immediately grabbed his radio, his voice sharp with command authority. "All units, cease fire. I repeat, cease fire. We have a hostage situation in progress." But the damage was done. Through his scope, Marcus could see the chaos erupting on the third floor. The young men were no longer listening, no longer thinking rationally. One of them grabbed a rifle and fired wildly toward the British position, while another disappeared down the stairwell, presumably toward where the child was being held. "Hayes, do you have a shot that wouldn't risk the child?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. "Negative, sir. Too much movement, too many unknowns. If I fire now, we could hit the girl or cause them to hurt her in panic." Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of the outcome. "I'm going in. Hayes, you maintain overwatch. Martinez, come with me. We're going to need your language skills and medical training." "Sir, that's suicide." Hayes protested. "Let me call on the full unit. We can surround the building and guarantee that child dies in the crossfire." "No. Sometimes the weight of command means making the choice that puts your own life on the line instead of ordering others to do it." Marcus checked his rifle one more time, then slung it across his back. "I'm going to walk straight to that front door. If they shoot me, you have permission to take them down. But I don't think they will. Those boys aren't killers. They're scared kids who made bad choices." Corporal Martinez swallowed hard but nodded. "I'm with you, General." Marcus stood up from behind the trees and began walking toward the mill, his hands held high, his rifle slung uselessly across his back. Every step felt like a mile. Every second stretched into an eternity. He'd faced enemy fire countless times, but walking deliberately into a hostage situation with children involved was a different kind of courage or madness. "Don't shoot," he called out in English, knowing Martinez would translate. "I'm General Marcus Thompson, United States Army. I'm coming in unarmed to talk. I'm here to help the child. That's all. No tricks, no assault. Just one man who doesn't want to see anyone hurt." The response from the mill was silence. Marcus kept walking, his heart pounding, but his face calm. He learned long ago that showing fear only made bad situations worse. When he reached the mill's main entrance, the heavy wooden door creaked open slightly. A young face peered out, a rifle barrel visible beside it. "Why should we trust you?" the youth asked in heavily accented English. "Because I'm giving you the choice," Marcus replied, stopping 10 feet from the door. "You can shoot me right now, and my men will storm this building, and everyone dies, including that little girl you're trying to protect. Or you can let me in, and we can figure out a way where everyone walks out alive. Your choice." The door opened wider. The young man who emerged couldn't have been more than 18, with the soft features of someone who should have been in university rather than holding a gun. His hand shook as he pointed the rifle at Marcus. "Put down your weapon," the youth demanded. Marcus slowly unslung his sniper rifle and laid it on the ground. "There. Now I'm unarmed. Your move." The young man gestured for Marcus to enter. As the general stepped through the doorway, Martinez followed close behind, his own weapon also set aside. The interior of the mill was dark and dusty, with shafts of light cutting through holes in the roof. The machinery that once drove the textile production stood silent and rusted, creating a maze of metal and shadows. 3 more young men waited inside, their weapons pointed but their eyes showing more fear than aggression. Marcus raised his hands again, showing he meant no harm. "Where's the child?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. One of them, a stocky youth with a scar across his cheek, responded in broken English. "Upstairs. She is scared. We did not mean for this. We only wanted to save her." "Then let me help you save her," Marcus said. Let me talk to her, make sure she's okay. Then we can figure out the rest." The young men exchanged glances, clearly uncertain. Finally, the one who had opened the door nodded. "Come. But if you try anything, if your soldiers attack, we will—" "Nobody's attacking," Marcus assured him. "You have my word. General, what were you in the Hitler Youth? Squad leaders? Trainers?" "I was a squad leader," the blonde one admitted. "Klaus. These are my friends, Dieter, Franz, and Werner. We're not bad people." "I believe you," Marcus said, and he meant it. Looking at these young men, he saw not enemies, but victims of a war machine that had chewed up and spit out an entire generation. "Lead the way." They climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step groaning under their weight. The building felt unstable, as if one wrong move could bring it all crashing down, a fitting metaphor for the situation itself. As they reached the second-floor landing, Marcus heard it, the soft, heartbreaking sound of a child crying. Klaus pushed open a door to reveal a small storage room. There, sitting on the floor amid scattered papers and broken furniture, was the little girl. She looked up as they entered, her blue eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her face. Marcus's heart clenched. She reminded him of the children he'd seen throughout the war, innocent victims of adult conflicts, bearing scars they never asked for. "Hello," he said softly in English, then looked at Martinez. "Tell her I'm here to help. Tell her she's safe now." The connection. As Corporal Martinez translated Marcus's words into German, the little girl pressed herself further into the corner, her small body trembling. The trauma she'd endured, losing her father, being taken by these desperate young men, the sounds of gunfire, had left her beyond words. Marcus recognized the signs of a child in shock, having seen too many like her across war-torn Europe. He slowly lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the floor, making himself less intimidating. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out something he'd carried since before the war, a small, carved wooden horse that his own daughter had made for him years ago. It was his good luck charm, something he touched whenever he needed to remember what he was fighting for. "This," he said softly, holding out the horse where the girl could see it, "was made by my little girl when she was about your age. Her name is Sarah. She's far away in America, probably sleeping right now. I miss her every day." Martinez translated, and Marcus saw the child's eyes flicker toward the wooden horse with the barest hint of curiosity. It was a start. Klaus and his companions watched nervously from the doorway. "She has not spoken since yesterday," Klaus said quietly. "We try to feed her, to comfort her, but she will not take anything from us. She is afraid." Marcus nodded, understanding. These young men might have thought they were rescuing her, but to a 6-year-old child who had just lost her father, they were simply more frightening adults in a world that had become incomprehensible. "What's her name?" Marcus asked. "Greta," Franz replied. "Greta Zimmermann. Her father was Hauptsturmführer Karl Zimmermann. He was executed 3 weeks ago for war crimes. Her mother died during the bombing of Dresden. Her grandmother is all she has left." Marcus processed this information carefully. The father had been an SS captain, likely guilty of terrible things. But this child bore no responsibility for her father's sins. She was just a little girl who had lost everything. "Greta," Marcus said gently, and the child's eyes met his. He slowly rolled the wooden horse across the floor toward her. It stopped a few inches from her feet. "This horse is very special to me. Would you like to hold it? You can give it back when you're ready." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, tentatively, Greta reached out and picked up the wooden horse. She held it in both hands, examining it with the careful attention that children give to precious things. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't cry out. "Good," Marcus said with a warm smile. "You know, that horse has traveled through Africa, through Italy, through France. It's been in many battles, but it's always kept me safe. Maybe it can help keep you safe, too." Outside, Marcus could hear movement, more soldiers arriving, probably the British unit that had fired the initial shot. Time was running out. He needed to get Greta out of this building before the situation escalated further. "Klaus," Marcus said, turning to the young squad leader, "I need you to listen carefully. More soldiers are coming. They don't know what I know, that you're trying to help this girl, not hurt her. If they storm this building, people will die. Probably Greta first, because she's in the line of fire. Is that what you want?" Klaus's face went pale. No, no, of course not. But if we surrender, we will be executed. We are former Hitler Youth. We took a child. They will show no mercy. Marcus stood slowly, keeping his movements calm and measured. "I'm going to make you a promise, and I need you to decide whether you believe me. If you let me take Greta out of here safely, I will personally guarantee that you and your friends are treated fairly. You won't be executed. You'll be processed as refugees, not prisoners of war. I have the authority to make that happen, and I give you my word as a soldier and as a father that I will keep that promise." "Why would you help us?" Dieter asked, suspicion in his voice. "We are Germans. We were your enemy." Marcus looked at each of them in turn. "The war is over. My enemy was never the German people. It was fascism, hatred, and the men who weaponized young people like you. You made mistakes, but you also tried to save a child when everyone else was content to let the system swallow her up. That tells me there's something worth saving in you too. It was a gamble, an appeal to whatever humanity still existed in these young men who had been raised on propaganda and violence." Marcus could see them wavering, wanting to believe him, but afraid to trust. Then Greta did something unexpected. She stood up, still clutching the wooden horse, and walked slowly to Marcus. She didn't say anything, but she reached up and took his hand. The trust of that small gesture, after all she'd been through, was like a physical blow. Marcus looked down at her and felt something crack in his chest. This was why he'd fought through the discrimination, the slights, the battles both military and social. For moments like this, where he could make a difference in one child's life. "I'm taking her out now," Marcus announced, his voice brooking no argument. "Martinez, come with us. Klaus, you and your friends need to make a choice. Stay here and face whatever comes, or follow us out and trust that I'll keep my word. But decide fast. We have maybe 5 minutes before this place is surrounded." Klaus looked at his companions, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, he nodded. "We come with you. But, General, if you betray us—" "I won't," Marcus said simply. "Martinez, radio Hayes. Tell him we're coming out with the child and 4 surrendering personnel. No one fires unless fired upon. Make sure the British get that message, too." As Martinez relayed the orders, Marcus knelt beside Greta one more time. "We're going to walk outside now, into the sunshine. There will be lots of soldiers, but they're not going to hurt you. I promise. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" Greta nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. Marcus stood and gently picked her up, settling her on his hip the way he'd carried his own daughter years ago. She wrapped her thin arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. With Greta in his arms, Marcus led the group down the stairs and toward the main entrance. Each step felt like walking a tightrope, knowing that one wrong move, one panicked soldier, one misunderstood order could turn this rescue into a tragedy. The gauntlet. The afternoon sun seemed blindingly bright as Marcus stepped through the mill's entrance, Greta held securely in his arms. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. At least 30 soldiers, both American and British, had surrounded the building, weapons trained on the doorway. Tank barrels pointed at the structure, and he could see snipers positioned on nearby rooftops. This was no longer a hostage negotiation. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. "Hold your fire," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the weight of his rank and years of command. "I have the child. She's safe." Greta whimpered against his shoulder, and Marcus could feel her small body tensing with fear. Behind him, Klaus and his companions emerged slowly, their hands raised high, their makeshift weapons abandoned inside the mill. The young men's faces were ashen, their eyes wide with the realization that they were now facing the full might of the Allied forces. A British major, his face red with anger, pushed forward through the ranks. "General Thompson, those men are enemy combatants who have taken hostage. Step aside and let us handle this." "These men are surrendering peacefully," Marcus replied, his voice firm but controlled. "The child is unharmed. There will be no further violence here today." "Unharmed?" They kidnapped her. They've been firing at my soldiers." The major gestured sharply, and several soldiers moved forward with weapons raised. Marcus didn't budge. "Major, I am ranking officer here, and I'm ordering you to stand down. These young men will be processed through proper channels, not executed in the street. They're Hitler Youth," the British officer spat. "They're as guilty as any SS officer. They're teenagers who made poor choices," Marcus countered. He could feel Greta trembling against him, her small hands clutching his uniform. "And right now, you're scaring a 6-year-old girl who has already lost everything. Is that really the victory you're looking for?" The standoff stretched for long seconds. Marcus could see Sergeant Hayes in his peripheral vision, his rifle trained not on Klaus and his friends, but on the British soldiers who seemed most eager to fire. Corporal Martinez stood ready to translate, his body tense with anticipation. Finally, an American colonel stepped forward, someone Marcus recognized from command briefings. "General Thompson is correct. Lower your weapons. We'll take these men into custody for proper interrogation and trial. Major Hendricks, your men will stand down." The British major looked like he wanted to argue, but military protocol won out. Gradually, the soldiers lowered their weapons, though many kept suspicious eyes on the surrendering youths. Marcus carried Greta forward, speaking softly to her in English while Martinez translated. "See, we're walking through all these soldiers and nobody's hurting us. You're safe now, Greta. I promise you're safe." A military doctor rushed forward with a stretcher and medical equipment, but Greta clung tighter to Marcus, refusing to let go. The general looked at the doctor and shook his head slightly. "Let me get her to the medical tent first. She needs a familiar face right now, even if it's only been familiar for a few minutes." As they walked through the cordon of soldiers, Marcus heard the MPs taking Klaus and his companions into custody. The young men went quietly, their faces showing a mixture of relief and fear. Klaus caught Marcus's eye as he was being handcuffed. "Thank you," the young man said simply. Tell Greta we are sorry. We only wanted to help." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the sentiment without condoning their actions. The road to hell, as the saying went, was paved with good intentions. These young men would face consequences for their choices, but at least they would face justice rather than a firing squad. At the medical tent, Marcus finally sat down, still holding Greta. The little girl had not loosened her grip on him, and he wasn't about to force her. A female nurse, Corporal Sarah Winters, approached gently with a warm blanket and a cup of sweetened tea. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly in German, having grown up in a German-American community. "My name is Sarah. Can I check to make sure you're not hurt anywhere?" Greta looked at Marcus as if asking permission. He nodded encouragingly. "It's okay. She's here to help make sure you're healthy." Slowly, Greta allowed the nurse to examine her. The medical assessment revealed malnutrition, dehydration, and signs of severe psychological trauma, but no physical injuries. As Corporal Winters worked, she kept up a gentle stream of conversation, telling Greta about her own childhood in Pennsylvania, about a farm with horses and cows, and a big red barn. "General," Corporal Winters said quietly, "she's physically okay, but she needs proper food, rest, and probably extended psychological care. The trauma of losing her parents, being caught up in that situation, it's going to take time to heal." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. Anger at a world that had done this to a child. Sadness for the innocence stolen by war. Relief that at least this one small life had been saved. "What happens to her now?" he asked. According to protocol, she should go to the displaced persons camp until suitable relatives can be found. "But, General," Corporal Winters hesitated. "Those camps are overcrowded, undersupplied, and frankly not equipped to handle a traumatized child. She needs more specialized care." Marcus was already forming a plan. "I want a full background check on the grandmother these young men mentioned. If she's cleared of Nazi affiliations and is capable of caring for a child, I want Greta transported to her directly. In the meantime, find a foster family among the local German civilians who have been vetted, preferably someone with children, someone who can provide a stable environment for a few days." "Sir, that's not standard procedure," Lieutenant Corwin said. having arrived at the medical tent. Displaced children go through the designated channels. I'm making it standard procedure, Marcus replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. This child has been through enough. She's not going to become another number in an overwhelmed system if I can prevent it. Make it happen, Lieutenant. As the sun began to set, Marcus finally succeeded in gently transferring Greta to Corporal Winters' care. The little girl resisted at first, but the presence of another woman, speaking her language, offering warmth and kindness, gradually won her over. As Marcus prepared to leave the medical tent, Greta suddenly called out, "Das Pferd," the horse. Marcus realized she still had his wooden horse clutched in her hand. He walked back and knelt beside her. "You keep it," he said through Martinez's translation. "It will keep you safe, just like it kept me safe. When you're older, when you're happy again, you remember that even in the darkest times, there are people who care. Promise me." Greta nodded, tears streaming down her face, but for the first time, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. Ghosts and consequences. 3 days after the incident at the mill, General Marcus Thompson sat in his temporary office, reviewing reports that would determine the fate of Klaus and his 3 companions. The young men were being held in a detention facility, awaiting formal charges and trial. Outside his window, the town of Rothenburg was slowly returning to something resembling normal life. Shops reopening, children playing in the streets, the machinery of occupation settling into a routine. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this case represented something larger than just 4 young men who had made a terrible decision. It was a window into the complexity of post-war Germany, where the lines between victim and perpetrator, between salvation and damnation, were far blurrier than anyone wanted to admit. His adjutant entered with a thick folder. "Sir, the background checks you requested. Klaus Brenner, Dieter Schultz, Franz Weber, and Werner Hartmann. I think you should read this before the tribunal tomorrow." Marcus opened the folder and began reading. What he found was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Klaus Brenner, age 18, orphaned when his parents were killed in a bombing raid on Hamburg. Joined the Hitler Youth at age 12, not out of ideological conviction, but because it was the only way to get regular meals. His mother had been Jewish, a fact his father had hidden until it got them both killed. Dieter Schultz, age 17, son of a farmer who had spoken out against the Nazi regime and was sent to a labor camp, where he died. Dieter had been raised by an uncle who was a true believer in the Nazi cause. The boy's psyche had been pulled in 2 directions his entire adolescence. Franz Weber, age 19, and Werner Hartmann, age 18, both came from families of minor Nazi Party officials. But the reports included testimony from townspeople describing how both young men had secretly helped hide Jewish families, had sabotaged military equipment, and had expressed growing disillusionment with the regime in the final months of the war. These weren't the fanatical SS officers Marcus had fought against. These were confused, traumatized young people who had grown up in a society that had twisted their sense of right and wrong, then left them to navigate a world where their entire identity had been invalidated overnight. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Corporal Martinez entered, his face troubled. "General, there's someone here to see you." Frau Ingrid Zimmermann, Greta's grandmother. An elderly woman entered, leaning heavily on a cane. She was thin, her face lined with years of hardship, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She looked at Marcus with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "You are the general who saved my granddaughter," she said in accented but clear English. "I want to thank you, but I also want to know, what happens to her now? What happens to me? Are we to be punished for my son's crimes?" Marcus gestured for her to sit. "Your granddaughter is safe, Frau Zimmermann. She's being cared for by a local family who have been vetted by our intelligence services. As for punishment, can you tell me what you knew of your son's activities?" The old woman's hands trembled. "I knew Karl was in the SS. I did not know the details, but I am not a fool, General. I knew that terrible things were happening. I am ashamed that I did not do more to stop it, ashamed that fear kept me silent, ashamed that my son, that he—" She couldn't finish, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Did you support the Nazi Party?" Marcus asked gently. "No, My husband was killed in the First War, General Thompson. I have seen what hatred and nationalism do to young men. I try to teach Carl better, but the times, the propaganda, the pressure, I failed him. And now Greta pays the price for that failure. Marcus studied her carefully. He'd become adept at reading people, at distinguishing genuine remorse from calculated performance. What he saw in Frau Zimmermann was authentic grief and a desperate love for her granddaughter. I'm recommending that Greta be placed in your custody, Marcus said finally. You'll be monitored, and you'll need to report regularly to the Allied authorities. But I believe that child needs her family, and you need her. Can I trust you to raise her differently than your son was raised? The old woman looked at him with such gratitude that Marcus had to look away. I swear to you, on my husband's grave, on my own life, that I will teach her love, not hate. Compassion, not cruelty. I will make sure she knows that what her father did was wrong, but that she is not defined by his sins. After Frau Zimmermann left, Marcus returned to the files on Klaus and his companions. The tribunal would convene tomorrow, and he needed to decide what recommendation he would make. The British wanted harsh sentences, years in prison, possibly execution for what they viewed as kidnapping and assault. The Americans were divided, with some sharing the British sentiment, while others argued for leniency given the young men's ages and circumstances. That evening, Marcus did something he rarely did. He visited the detention facility personally to speak with Klaus. The young man was brought to a small interrogation room, looking thinner and more haunted than he had just days before. "Why are you here?" Klaus asked, his English stilted and uncertain. "Have you come to tell me when I die?" "I've come to understand," Marcus replied. "Tell me, Klaus, when did you realize that what you'd been taught your entire life was wrong?" Klaus looked surprised by the question. He sat silently for a long moment before answering. "When I saw the camps," he said quietly. "They told us they were work camps, places to keep enemies of the Reich. But when the Americans came, when the gates opened, I saw what we had done, what my country had done. I was not there. I was too young to serve at the camps, but I had believed the lies. I had participated in the system that made it possible. So why take Greta? Why not just walk away from it all?" "Because I could not save the others," Klaus said, his voice breaking. "I could not bring back the dead, could not undo what had been done. But there was one child, one innocent life that I could try to protect from becoming another victim of this world we had created. Even if I did it wrong, even if I made it worse, I had to try to do something right. Just once." Marcus understood that impulse. It was the same one that had driven him to walk unarmed into that mill, the same one that had compelled him to fight for every innocent life he'd encountered throughout the war. The need to do something right in a world that had gone terribly wrong. "The tribunal meets tomorrow," Marcus said. "I can't promise anything, but I want you to know that I'm going to tell them what I've learned. What happens after that, it's out of my hands." "General Thompson," Klaus said as Marcus prepared to leave. "That child, Greta, is she truly safe? Do we succeed in that, at least?" "She's with her grandmother, being cared for, beginning to heal." "So yes, Klaus, in that at least you succeeded." The tribunal. The military tribunal convened in the town hall's largest room, converted into a makeshift courtroom. 3 judges presided, an American colonel, a British major general, and a French captain, representing the major Allied powers. Marcus sat in the gallery, having been called as a primary witness, his sniper rifle secured in the weapons room, but his memories of that day sharp and clear. Klaus, Dieter, Franz, and Werner stood before the bench in ill-fitting prisoner uniforms, their faces showing the toll of their confinement. They had been provided with a defense attorney, Captain Theodore Morrison, a lawyer from Boston who had volunteered for the Judge Advocate General's Corps. The charges were read: unlawful detention of a minor, armed resistance against Allied forces, theft of military supplies, and conspiracy to evade military justice. Each charge carried the potential for years of imprisonment or, in the most extreme interpretation, execution. The prosecution, led by a severe British lieutenant colonel named Ashford, laid out a damning case. He described Klaus and his companions as unrepentant Nazi youth who had kidnapped an innocent child and opened fire on Allied soldiers attempting a rescue. He showed photographs of the mill, marked with bullet holes and shell casings. He called witnesses who testified to hearing gunfire and screaming. These young men, Ashford concluded, represent the poisonous ideology that we have spent years fighting to eliminate. They do not deserve mercy. They deserve justice, swift and severe. When it came time for the defense, Captain Morrison called Marcus as his first witness. The general took the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. General Thompson, Morrison began, "You were the first Allied officer on the scene during this incident. In your professional military opinion, were these young men attempting to harm the child, Greta Zimmerman?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "No, I do not believe they were attempting to harm her. I believe they were trying, in their misguided way, to protect her from a system they feared would swallow her up. Their methods were wrong, dangerous even, but their intent was not malicious." "Did they fire upon you or your men?" "No. All shots fired by the defendants were defensive in nature, aimed at warning approaching forces rather than targeting individuals. In fact, when I approached the mill unarmed, they allowed me entry and permitted me to remove the child without resistance." Ashford stood for cross-examination, his face skeptical. "General, are you aware that these men were indoctrinated in the Hitler Youth? That they were trained to be the next generation of Nazi soldiers?" "I'm aware of their history," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm also aware that children cannot be held entirely responsible for the indoctrination imposed upon them by adults. The Hitler Youth was not a choice for most German children. It was a requirement enforced through social pressure and legal mandate. But surely, General, as someone who has fought against the Nazi regime, you must want to see these young men punished for their role in it." Marcus met Ashford's gaze directly. "What I want, Lieutenant Colonel, is to see justice served. Justice means considering context, intent, and the possibility of redemption. These young men made poor choices, but they also tried to save a child's life when they could have simply walked away. That tells me something important about who they are, beyond the uniform they once wore." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Ashford looked frustrated, but he had no effective rebuttal to Marcus's testimony. The general's reputation as a war hero and his status as one of the highest-ranking black officers in the Army gave his words significant weight. Additional witnesses were called. Corporal Martinez testified about his conversations with the young men, describing their obvious distress and concern for Greta's welfare. The local German civilians who had been questioned described Klaus and his companions as troubled but not evil, young people who had shown kindness to townspeople after the war ended. Most powerfully, Frau Ingrid Zimmermann took the stand. The elderly woman spoke through a translator, describing how Klaus had come to her weeks before, asking about her willingness to take Greta, explaining that he feared the child would be lost in the chaos of displaced persons camps. She testified that he had made her promise to raise Greta with love, to teach her that her father's actions were wrong, to give her a chance at a normal life. "This young man," she said, pointing at Klaus with a trembling hand, "made mistakes, but his heart was trying to do right by my granddaughter when others were content to look away. Is that not worth something?" The judges retired to deliberate. The wait stretched for hours. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, smoking a rare cigarette despite having mostly quit years ago. Corporal Martinez joined him, the two men standing in companionable silence. "Do you think they'll show mercy, sir?" Martinez asked. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "Military justice can be rigid, especially when emotions are running high. But I've said my piece. The rest is up to them." Finally, the judges returned. The courtroom fell silent as the American colonel, serving as Chief Justice, stood to read the verdict. "The tribunal has carefully considered all evidence and testimony in this matter. We find the defendants guilty of unlawful detention of a minor and theft of military supplies. However, we find extenuating circumstances in their youth, their lack of malicious intent, and their cooperation once approached by General Thompson. Therefore, we sentence each defendant to 3 years of supervised labor and rehabilitation, with the possibility of early release pending good behavior and demonstrated commitment to democratic principles. They will be monitored by Allied authorities and required to participate in denazification education programs. It was a compromise, punishment, but not destruction. Klaus and his companions would face consequences, but they would also have a chance to rebuild their lives. As they were led away, Klaus caught Marcus's eye and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Seeds of tomorrow. 6 months later, Marcus stood in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Rothenburg, paying his respects to the German civilians who had died in the final days of the war. It was a cold spring morning, with frost still clinging to the grass and the first tentative flowers just beginning to bloom. He was due to ship back to the United States the following week, his tour of duty in occupied Germany finally coming to an end. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Corporal Sarah Winters, the nurse who had cared for Greta in those first critical days. She'd been reassigned to a hospital in Munich, but had requested leave to return to Rothenburg for a special occasion. They were waiting for Frau Zimmermann and Greta, who had asked to meet with Marcus one last time before he returned home. The general had stayed in contact with them through letters, monitoring Greta's progress and ensuring that both grandmother and granddaughter were receiving adequate support from the Allied authorities. A small figure appeared at the cemetery gate, running ahead of an older woman who struggled to keep pace. Greta had grown in 6 months, not just physically, but in a way that Marcus couldn't quite quantify. The haunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by something that resembled cautious hope. She ran straight to Marcus and wrapped her arms around his waist. "General Thompson," she exclaimed in careful English, clearly having been practicing. "I missed you." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I missed you too, Greta. Look how much you've grown. And your English is excellent." Frau Zimmermann arrived, breathing heavily but smiling. "She has been practicing every day," the old woman said. "She says that when she grows up, she wants to be a translator so she can help people understand each other. So there are fewer wars." "That's a noble goal," Marcus said, kneeling to be at a level with Greta. "The world needs more people who can help others understand each other." Greta reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and worn, the wooden horse that Marcus had given her in the mill. "I want to give this back," she said solemnly. "You said I should keep it until I was happy again. I am happy now, so you should have it back to keep you safe." Marcus looked at the small carved figure, remembering his own daughter making it years ago, remembering carrying it through battles and bombings, remembering rolling it across the floor to a terrified child in a mill. "I'll tell you what," he said. "You keep it, but not for yourself. Keep it so that someday, when you meet someone who needs it more than you do, you can give it to them. Can you do that?" Greta considered this seriously, then nodded. "I promise. I will find someone who needs hope, and I will give them the horse, just like you gave it to me." They walked through the cemetery together, Greta chattering about her school, her new friends, the garden she and her grandmother were planting. Marcus listened, marveling at the resilience of children, their capacity to heal and grow even after experiencing unimaginable trauma. "General," Frau Zimmermann said quietly as Greta ran ahead to examine the early flowers, "I received word from the rehabilitation center. Klaus and the others are doing well. They're learning trades, carpentry, mechanics. Klaus asked me to tell you that he is reading every book he can find about the war, learning the truth of what happened. He says it is painful, but necessary." Marcus nodded. Redemption is never easy, but it's possible if someone is willing to do the work. He also wanted you to know that he is keeping a journal, documenting his experiences, his journey from believing lies to understanding truth. He hopes that someday, when Germany has healed enough, he can share it with young people so they understand how easy it is to be led astray by hatred and ideology. "That's good work," Marcus said. "The world needs those stories, needs to understand how ordinary people can be swept up in extraordinary evil. It's the only way to prevent it from happening again." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Greta tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Will you write to me?" she asked. "From America?" "I promise," Marcus said. "And I'll send you pictures of my daughter Sarah. She's not so different from you. She also loves horses and flowers and dreams of making the world better." Greta hugged him one more time, fierce and tight. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered. "Not just from the mill. Thank you for showing me that not all soldiers are scary, that not all people want to hurt me. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, but refused to let them fall. You saved yourself, Greta. You were brave enough to trust when you had every reason not to. That's the kind of courage that will serve you your whole life. That evening, back at the base, Marcus wrote 2 letters. The first was to his wife and daughter, telling them he would finally be coming home, that his war was finally over. The second was to the rehabilitation center, addressed to Klaus Brenner. In it, he wrote, "You asked me once why I would help you, why I would put my reputation on the line to defend young men who had been part of the system I fought against. The answer is simple. I fought this war not just to defeat an enemy, but to build a world where redemption is possible, where children like Greta can grow up without fear, and where young men like you can learn from their mistakes and become forces for good. Hold on to that. In your darkest moments, remember that you helped save a child, and that act of compassion, however flawed its execution, revealed the humanity that propaganda tried to destroy. Build your life on that foundation." On his last day in Germany, Marcus returned one final time to the textile mill. It stood empty now, scheduled for demolition to make way for new construction. He walked through the abandoned building, climbing to the second floor, where he'd first seen Greta huddled in the corner. He thought about the chain of events that had led to that moment. The war, the hatred, the propaganda, but also the courage, the compassion, and the unexpected connections that had formed across enemy lines. He thought about Klaus and his companions, their misguided attempt at heroism that could have ended in tragedy. He thought about his own decision to walk unarmed into danger, trusting in the better angels of human nature, even in the darkest of times. Most of all, he thought about Greta, about the wooden horse that would carry a legacy of hope forward into an uncertain future. In saving one child, he hadn't ended all suffering or erased all the wrongs of the war. But he had proven something important, that even in the aftermath of unspeakable evil, even amid the ruins of a shattered society, individual acts of compassion could plant seeds of healing. As he walked out of the mill for the last time, Marcus understood that this story, his story, Greta's story, Klaus's story, would ripple forward in ways he might never fully comprehend. That little girl would grow up, would remember the black general who saw her humanity when she was at her most vulnerable. She would tell her children and grandchildren about the day a stranger risked his life to save hers. Klaus and his companions would rebuild their lives, would become men who understood the cost of hatred and the value of compassion. And Marcus? He would return home to his own family, carrying with him the knowledge that despite the discrimination he'd faced, despite the wars he'd fought, despite all the darkness he'd witnessed, he had made a difference. He had proven that courage came in many forms, not just in wielding a weapon, but in setting it down, not just in defeating an enemy, but in seeing the humanity in those who had been enemies. The sun was setting as Marcus boarded the transport that would begin his journey home. He thought about his sniper rifle, packed away in his footlocker, a tool that had served him well, but which he hoped he'd never need to use again. He thought about Greta, clutching a small wooden horse, rebuilding a life from the ruins of war. And he thought about the fundamental truth that had driven him through decades of service, through battles both military and social, that the measure of a person was not in the weapons they carried, but in the lives they chose to protect. That real courage was not in the ability to take a life, but in the willingness to save one. Years later, when he would tell this story to his grandchildren, they would ask if he had been afraid when he walked into that mill, unarmed and alone. Marcus would think carefully before answering, wanting to give them the truth. Yes, he would say, I was terrified, but I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't try. More afraid of a world where we stop seeing the humanity in each other, where we let one more child become another casualty of our conflicts. Fear is natural, but courage is choosing to act anyway, choosing compassion over convenience, choosing hope over hatred. And somewhere in Germany, a grown woman named Greta would tell her own children about the black general who had saved her life, who had shown her that even in the darkest times, there were people who chose kindness. She would show them a small, worn wooden horse, and she would teach them the lesson that Marcus had taught her, that hope, like love, multiplies when you give it away. The story of General Marcus Thompson and the 6-year-old German child would become part of the fabric of both their families' histories, a reminder that heroism comes in unexpected forms, that redemption is always possible for those who seek it, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a soldier can do is choose not to fire their weapon. As a transport plane lifted off from German soil, Marcus looked down at the country he'd helped to liberate and now helped to rebuild. Somewhere down there, a little girl was sleeping peacefully, a wooden horse beside her pillow. Somewhere, for young men were learning that their mistakes did not define them, that they could build new identities based on compassion rather than hate. And a black general who had fought against prejudice both at home and abroad, who had risen to command despite every obstacle placed in his path, carried with him the knowledge that his greatest victory had nothing to do with battles won or enemies defeated. His greatest triumph was in showing one terrified child that she mattered, that her life had value, that there were still good people in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. That was the story of how one U.S. black general, armed only with a sniper rifle he chose not to use, saved a 6-year-old German child, not through violence, but through courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that every life is worth saving.